With me today is Chadley Stern. He's a professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's also someone I would call a friend. You don't have to chime in on that, Chadley, but we've known each other since we were really first applying for graduate school in 2010, 2011. And so we've been friends ever since, and only recently in the last 3 or 4 years, we've also been collaborators. So Chadley, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess I'll start broadly. And when you think of yourself as a researcher, what are the main questions that you focus on answering?
Yeah, so if I had to describe myself in 1 or 2 sentences, I would say that I'm a political psychologist who's interested in questions that are social cognitive in nature. So I have a couple different lines of research, but they really focus around the idea of how a person's political belief systems shape the way that they perceive the world and engage in everyday interactions. So for example, in one line of research, what I'm interested in looking at is how people who are politically liberal versus conservative differ in the way that they use and process information in a variety of different domains. So it could be very basic things like the extent to which liberals and conservatives like to engage in deliberation and cognitive reflection, as well as things that have more social relevance and group relevance, like understanding social categorization and prejudice and stereotyping.
Okay. And so I think that this is pretty self-evident, but I like to give each person that I interview the opportunity to say something about this in their own words. So, political orientation, it seems like a very fundamental individual difference and can shape a lot of the ways that we see the world. But in your own words, why do you think that this area of research is important?
Yeah, so I think that it certainly has value, especially in the world's political climate, because we've seen this increase in the extent to which people are identifying with political groups and the extent to which people are politically knowledgeable. So it's become a really important part of a lot of people's identities, and it really influences a lot of the dynamics in their everyday life. But I think it also has a lot of importance just for theory development and empirical findings, because really our political beliefs are an important organizing principle for our own everyday lives, where in the literature we document that there's a lot of different relationships that exist among a variety of constructs. So we might talk about different types of motivations that are epistemic in nature, like wanting closure and structure and order, as well as motivations for connection and affiliation. And all of these basic psychological motivations are important, but I think that by looking at political ideology and thinking about how ideological differences are explained by these types of motivations, we can develop a more sort of singular and coherent understanding of how to make sense of these findings in a broader picture.
Okay. So the paper that we went over in lecture was about this association between political orientation and people's comfort with and their confidence in gleaning social category information from someone. And so you found that conservatives were more confident in their ability to glean social category information than liberals. Mm-hmm. But I think it'd be helpful for the students, and for me, frankly, you tie this into more general research about the role of stereotyping and its connection to 2 processes, the processes for maintaining group hierarchy and the process for need for structure. So I, in theory, know this, but you're the expert. So could you tell us a little bit more about the connection between those two outcomes, stereotyping and SDO, or in group hierarchy, and stereotyping and need for structure?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of different types of stereotypes that exist in the world. What research traditionally focused on are sort of things having to do with cultural ideas about traits and attributes that groups possess. So, for example, the extent to which certain racial groups might possess different academic or career interests or different sort of degrees of intellectual capability. Those are stereotypes that have been pervasive in society and that have sort of really shaped a lot of modern intergroup outcomes as well that we're continuing to grapple with as a society. But more recently, people have also gotten interested in understanding how stereotypes about physical characteristics can also influence judgments. So for example, the extent to which a person has masculine or feminine facial features influencing the sex judgment that a person might make, or a sexual orientation judgment. And so what I was interested in looking at here, and and just sort of thinking about more broadly in the literature, is how these different motivations that you mentioned could correspond to stereotyping of both general trait attributes, like do you think a group is dangerous, as well as attributes about physical characteristics. Like if you look at someone and you look at their facial characteristics and you use those stereotypes, linking facial characteristics to sex or sexual orientation, do you think you're going to make an accurate judgment? And really, those two motivations you mentioned should equally pretty much correspond to these different types of stereotyping. So social dominance orientation, or just this general motivation to uphold group-based hierarchy, would correspond to stereotyping in terms of trait attributes, because generally those attributes tend to be negative when they are ascribed to members of lower status groups like racial minorities and women and sexual minorities. So attributes having to do with low intellectual capability, or dangerousness or threat or something like that. Whereas the cultural stereotypes that we tend to attach to the higher status groups, like white people and men and heterosexuals, tend to be much more positive in nature. So if you're a person who is motivated in upholding hierarchy and legitimizing structural inequality, you are going to be more likely to say that those stereotypes are true, that members of those groups actually do possess those stereotypes on average, or to an extreme extent, because that allows you to feel that that hierarchy is not just something that we've produced arbitrarily, but is actually something that is just and necessary and just inevitable. And the same type of process can unfold when we think about stereotyping based on physical attributes. If you're a person who is very high on wanting to oppress members of marginalized groups, when you scan your social environment, you can't individuate each of those people to figure out who is an in-group member and who is an out-group member. You can't go up to the person and just ask them, hey, are you this or that? Like, that's just not going to work. It's obviously, there's a lot of reasons for that, but including the fact that it's just not cognitively efficient. So if you want to uphold hierarchy, what is more effective in a person's mind is being able to think, oh, I can just look at all of the people that I'm seeing in my community and in my social network, and I can figure out what their race is or what their religion is just by looking. And then they can show preference for people who are in the out group, and in terms of social preferences, like who do you become friends with, as well as economic things, like who do you give raises to and who do you allocate resources to in your organization or in your job space. So, sorry, did we freeze? I think you got a little frozen there. We're back? Okay.
We're back.
Okay, we're good. And so from that perspective, that's how these stereotypes could come to be endorsed and to be used depending on where you stand on wanting to enforce group-based hierarchy. But there's also this other motivation that I think is really important that we talk about as need for structure. So this basic idea that we want our world to be organized and simple and predictable. So, when we go to the grocery store, we like to have this predictable idea of what it's going to look like. We know, what we can pay with. We know what the cashier is going to say to us when we take our groceries up to pay for them. In the context of an academic space, in some ways, what the pandemic has done is disrupted our sense of structure, where students are used to going into a classroom knowing what to expect. Like, what does a professor look like? What do they do? What are the expectations of a syllabus? And now everything is online. And in part, it makes us uncomfortable because it's disruptive to this predictable, simple world that we've created in a very wide way throughout many, many cultures. And that occurs to the same degree when we're thinking about social groups. So even if a person doesn't necessarily feel negatively toward a social group, they might have this really strong desire to be able to make predictions about that person based on their group membership. So one thing that has really increased in popularity that's very interesting are gender reveal parties. So people will post online and have really elaborate parties where they invite family and friends what the genitalia of their child is going to be, which is really interesting because in terms of social significance, it shouldn't have any, it's just biological. But it does, we turn it into having social significance because when we find out whether the cake had blue or pink in it or what confetti was in the balloon, a lot of people will use that to make inferences about well, what types of career might this child be interested in? Or what colors are they going to like? What clothes are they going to wear? Are they going to be masculine or feminine? What gender might their relationship partner be? Even though at a gender reveal party, the kid hasn't even been born yet. So you obviously have no idea, and there's a ton of heterogeneity and reality to the things that individuals like and the things that they pursue based on their gender. So I think that's a good example of a context where it's not that people who have gender reveal parties or use gender of a child to make inferences about their future life are trying to oppress women, but instead they're just trying to fill the world in with these forms of organizing ideas. That's what stereotypes are essentially, because otherwise it's just filled with a lot of gaps and blanks that make us uncomfortable as humans. So then when we think about this motivation for structure guiding stereotyping, what we'll see is often a unique effect where people who are high on need for structure endorsing stereotypes about groups, even if they don't feel negatively towards those groups. And we see that also then in turn, in terms of the sort of the ideas that people have about being able to categorize, where you want to be able to, again, look at your social environment, and rather than individuating each person, which is just impossible, like your mind would explode, you'd be perpetually depleted, we use physical appearance information to make judgments about a person's sex and race and so on, in part because it's cognitively efficient.
Right.
And if you're a person who values structure the most, you're going to be most inclined to do that, even if you're a person who is egalitarian.
So, I mean, jumping off that idea, so like many of your papers, all of your papers, this was very thorough, and I appreciated all the different things that you could rule out, this connection between political orientation and comfort with ascribing people to social categories. It's not just a function of explicit attitudes, or it's not just simply a function of conservatives having fewer of those categories, for example, in gender relative to liberals. One thought that I had while reading this was, I wonder what your thoughts on the role of miscomfort over a false positive. So, for example, would liberals and conservatives differ in if they had to make a judgment about someone and it turns out they were wrong? Would one group of people, you think, potentially be more bothered by that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And it reminds me of sort of the classic work on the in-group over-exclusion effect, where when people engage in social categorization, they sort of have this bias to not include people in the in-group unless there's just a preponderance of evidence suggesting that they are an in-group member. So for example, like the one-drop rule or hypodescent in social categorization, where people will categorize someone as Black, even if there's just one small signifying characteristic suggesting that they might not be white. And there are potentially multiple reasons for that, but one reason is this concern about preserving resources, especially if you're a person who is motivated to uphold hierarchy and you don't want to inadvertently allocate your precious resources to an outgroup member. And so while I definitely have never done any studies on this, it's a really interesting idea. And my prediction certainly would be that conservatives would be more distressed about that, especially if it's a situation that invokes valuable resources. And some of the work that makes me sort of have that prediction is the work that Amy Krosh has done on how scarcity can shape racial categorization, and how liberals and conservatives have different thresholds of categorizing race. So my guess is that conservatives would potentially have a more negative reaction to the degree that they have categorized a member of a minority group or a lower status group as being part of their group. Liberals might also be uncomfortable, but they might be uncomfortable for different reasons, potentially because they were wrong, and sort of like thinking about social categorization as a puzzle, where you're trying to figure out what a person's group membership is when there's a variety of different possible options. And as you mentioned, one thing that I found is that, liberals will list that social categories have more possible groups that are available to them. So conservatives say that, sex is just about being a man or a woman, and liberals will say, well, those are just two options, and we have a broader array of identities that actually are available. So liberals might also feel uncomfortable if they miscategorize someone, in part because, they feel that they've gotten something wrong that they've reflected on. But it could also be, especially if they categorize someone as belonging to a lower status group when they're not, that could create discomfort. And Carrie Johnson has some really great work on this that she's been doing over the past couple of years, where she finds that people have a straight categorization bias in sexual orientation judgments, where essentially people are hesitant to categorize someone as being gay, in part because of the stigma that's attached to that social identity. So it could be that in a context where a liberal person miscategorizes a straight person as gay, they could feel compunction for that because they have potentially created stigma for that person where there was none previously. But my guess is that it's complex. It might depend on a variety of things, which is, first time I'm thinking about this, but I'm already thinking of 4 moderators of how this would all work together.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yes,
well, when you come back in a few years, you can tell us all about all those moderators.
exactly.
Okay, so just a couple more questions here. So you are described yourself as a political psychologist, and obviously one of the big individual differences there is related to political orientation, liberals versus conservatives. Now, you're a US-based researcher. I imagine most of your samples are US-based, and so in the United States, that roughly maps onto Democrat versus Republican, but there are many different political systems throughout the world and many more varieties outside of just a two-party system. But do you think as a political psychologist that this idea of liberal versus conservative you can take that to many different contexts? It's not just so US specific?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And this comes up in terms of thinking about the generalizability of findings from the US all the time. And I do think that we can think about political orientation as mapping on to meaningful individual differences in people, regardless of where they are located historically or culturally. So the specific terminology that we might use in the labels will vary across time and space, but the way that we theoretically think about political orientation won't. So the way I would define it is that people who are more conservative are resistant to change. And when they are in favor of change, it's reactive change that brings us back to a previously known period of time that we might feel more comfortable with or that we have greater information about. Whereas liberalism, I would define as support for novel change. And so if you look outside of the United States in 2020, there are certainly a lot of different labels that could be given to political orientations, as well as the political groups that people belong to. But it's always possible to organize those different political parties or ideologies along a spectrum of the extent to which people oppose or support novel change. And so even if we're in a context where people say left-right, or they identify with a political party that most people have never heard of, in some ways, they're joining that political party because of a psychological predisposition to either support or resist novel change. So, do I think that you can measure ideology the same way everywhere? Absolutely not. And we should definitely not do that. But can you measure it everywhere? Yes, you just have to be cognizant of history and cultural context. And I think that's something that many people are sensitive to, but sometimes we're not. And it's a really difficult thing because we want to use the same measures everywhere possible because we want to create replicable, reproducible science. But you can't always use the same measures because they don't always make sense. And unfortunately, there is a bias that whatever is created in the United States sometimes gets unfortunately used as the default, and it shouldn't. We should certainly consider other cultures as having meaningful constructions of politics, and just realizing you might need to measure support or opposition to change in a slightly different way.
So you mentioned something interesting there about not only being this liberal conservative difference across space, but also across time. So just hypothetically, you're graduate student. Let's get, 6 or 7 generations down the road here. Who knows what kind of issues or parties they'll be studying about for political psychology, but you still think there'll be some component of liberal versus conservative?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just by definition, there's always going to be people who support novel change and there's going to be people who resist it. And like you said, those issues might change. So, as psychologists, we're no longer focusing as strongly on issues of things like racial integration.
Okay, we're freezing a little bit. Hopefully Chadley will come back to us.
Make it back in.
Yes.
Okay, and I think we're back. So no longer are we thinking about liberals versus conservatives in terms of opposition to interracial marriage or integrated busing or something like that, we, eventually then shifted to thinking about same-sex marriage. And now that's slowly becoming a thing of the past, at least in the United States, where most people are supportive, but certainly not all. And there's always going to be these new issues, but it really is just going to boil down to the differences in the attitudes that people have towards those issues are to some degree going to be derived towards, are they a supporter of novel change, or are they uncomfortable with it because they are a person who values structure and group-based hierarchy? So, and that's one reason why I really like just the general sort of vanilla definition of like liberal, conservative, left, right, opposition or support for change, as opposed to sort of measuring with specific issues, because those are constantly dynamic and changing and always need to be updated.
Okay, so you've been very generous with your time. I told you this would be 15 minutes, and I've tricked you into much longer than that. But
oh, this is fun.
I do like to end on this question. Thinking a bit more narrowly in the time frame. Let's say in the next 10 or 15 years, or what are the questions that you think that you hope that this field of political psychology investigates most, or makes the most progress on in the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So for me personally, what I'm really excited about seeing more of is research that dives into the psychological motivations behind what liberals do. So other people have raised this point, and it's been raised for a long time in political psych, that a lot of what we focus on when we talk about explaining liberal conservative differences is trying to understand why people who are on the political right are doing what they're doing. And to some degree, there's a variety of reasons for why that might be, but part of it has to do with just the historical trajectory of where the research came from and what motivated it. But we definitely know less about what is driving liberals and what they actually are doing in everyday interactions. So in the context of the paper that your class read and discussed, I framed it very much as that conservatives are more likely to say that they can accurately glean group memberships from physical appearance. And another way of framing it could be liberals are less likely to do so. But then that raises the questions of, well, what are liberals doing during their everyday interactions? They are categorizing people, but what is going on? Like when they're in a bar or when they're in a classroom and they're encoding category information and they're updating and changing, what strategies are they using in order to make inferences that they then subsequently use to make, estimates of other things about that person? And I think that's something that's sort of been a more open question where, liberals, in an extreme form, liberals in some way can be sometimes categorized or characterized as sort of like robotic, rational, Bayesian updaters who don't have their own strong motivational profiles, but they certainly do. And we just haven't focused on it as much. And it's really left a pretty big picture of the literature unaddressed. And something that's super important, even though liberals are the minority everywhere, people who self-identify as liberal, there's generally always fewer than conservative, but it's always important to understand really what everyone is doing, especially like who are these people that are like advocating for novel changes in society and who are out protesting and really pushing back against the status quo. Like what is motivating that? And we have some info, not going to say it's been completely ignored, but we have a lot less compared to trying to understand what are the factors that shape resistance to change.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, I'm not much of a political psychologist, but it does seem to be that, a huge push in this field was focusing on what makes conservatives different, but they've kind of maybe been ignoring everything that liberals do. That's also a bit odd. So hopefully they can kind of tilt that seesaw over the next 10 or 15 years to get with a more balanced view of political psych. Well, thank you so much for your time, Chadley. I really appreciate this. And thank you again.
Yep, thanks. Thanks for having me.